My final line was crossed the moment I watched my wife lie motionless on the living room floor, through a camera feed from thousands of miles away. Training teaches you to identify a threat in seconds, to read the signs, the movements, the hostile intent. But no training can prepare you for an enemy who shares your blood. For years, I had built a fortress for my family, separate from those who always saw me as a resource, not a son. I was wrong to think that distance would keep us safe. Because what do you do when the people who were supposed to protect you become the invaders? When they bring the war to your very doorstep? My name is Donovan Hayes. I'm 32 years old, a captain in the United States Army. Out there, people know me by my rank, my iron discipline, and by operations that leave no room for error. But back home in Cedar Ridge with the uniform put away, I'm just Van husband to Serafina and dad to a 4-year-old kid named Killian. The rain outside was relentless, a persistent Washington drizzle that made the warmth inside feel like a deliberate victory. The town of Cedar Ridge was shrouded in mist, and the damp scent of pine needles seeped into the air. Dad, the watchtower goes here. I looked down at Killian. He was pointing to a corner of the Lego castle we were building. I nodded, my hands trained to assemble a rifle in the dark, moving with the same precision, to place each plastic brick in its spot. But my focus was no longer on a target. It was in the tiny hand that would occasionally reach out to steady a piece, and in the way he chattered on, commanding our operation. I memorized every detail. These were the moments I had fought my whole life to have. Energy for my nights. Serafina walked in, carrying 2 mugs of hot chocolate. She set one on the floor beside me, gently ran her fingers through my hair, and then sat down. Not many words were needed, just a simple gesture, but it was a reminder. This was a place with no judgment, no pressure. She was the one who helped me build this place. I glanced around. There were no staged family photos of the Hyaces on the walls. Instead, there were snapshots of us. Serafina radiant on our wedding day. Me holding Killian for the first time, the 3 of us covered in mud on a hiking trip. In the center was a child's crayon drawing, framed as if it were a priceless work of art. To me it was. This was our sanctuary, our fortress. This was my demilitarized zone, a perimeter that the ghosts of the past were not allowed to cross. I had fought in foreign lands to protect people I didn't know. I would do absolutely everything to protect this place. I looked over at Serafina. She sat there, sipping her hot chocolate, her gaze as calm as if all the storms in the world couldn't touch this room. In that moment, the memories flooded back, so clear I felt like I could reach out and touch them. The summer I was 10, my brother, Sterling, got a brand new gleaming BMX Mongoose. I got his old bike, sloppily repainted in a dark blue to hide the scratches. My parents' explanation: Sterling needs a good bike to hang out with his friends. Yours is fine for riding around the neighborhood. I stayed silent, but I already knew my place in this family. Years later, the favoritism was no longer simple. It was a calculated investment strategy. The day I received my acceptance letter to West Point, a feat few kids achieve, my father just clapped me on the shoulder. Good. At least the government will take care of you. That same year, they mortgaged part of the house so Sterling could pursue what he called his artistic passion at an expensive private college. He dropped out in less than 2 semesters. But the final straw, the moment every illusion I had about the word family shattered, was on my wedding day. The front row on the groom's side was empty. I can still picture it clearly. 3 oak chairs draped in white cloth, silent and cold. An hour before the ceremony, my mother called. Her voice was rushed, without a hint of apology. Sterling just closed a big deal in Las Vegas, and your father and I have to fly out to support him. You and Serafina will understand. It's just a party. Dad, it's just a party. I stood there, holding Serafina's hand, staring at the empty space. I didn't feel pain. I didn't feel anger. I just felt a cold clarity. In that moment, I made a choice. I stopped fighting a war I was destined to lose, and I began building my own fortress. Now, watching Serafina and Killian finish the castle, I knew I had made the right choice. I didn't have to care about them anymore. I had my own home. I had happiness, and I always had someone waiting for me to come back to. The peace didn't last long. My phone vibrated on the coffee table. The screen lit up with a name I hadn't saved, but I knew the number. Serafina looked up at me, her eyes filled with concern. I gave her a slight nod, a reassuring signal, then stood and walked out onto the back porch, where the rain had started to let up. My mother's voice was on the other end, frantic and tearful. A familiar tactic. She didn't ask how I was, didn't ask about Killian. She got straight to the point, like a blitz attack. Sterling's latest crypto venture had collapsed. He was in a massive amount of debt. The words tumbled out like a damage report. But the objective was clear. "He's your brother, Van," she sobbed. "You can't let him be ruined like this. You're a captain. Your salary can cover this." I took a deep breath, the cold afternoon air filling my lungs. Through the glass door I could see Serafina and Killian still playing, a world away. They were my responsibility. They were my duty. The image of the empty chairs on my wedding day came to mind, not as a pain, but as a reminder. An oath. My financial responsibility is to this family, to my wife and my son, I said, my voice flat, without a trace of hesitation. I can't. The answer is no. Silence. Then a rustle. My father had taken the phone. "You're a disappointment," he roared, his voice hoarse with anger. "You cold-hearted bastard. You let the army turn you into an emotionless machine." I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. Arguing with him was as pointless as trying to give orders to a hurricane. I had analyzed the situation. I had made my decision. Mission complete. I ended the call. When I stepped back inside, Serafina looked at me with a question in her eyes. I just shook my head. The silence in the room was heavy now. The storm had been summoned, and I knew it was heading straight for us. 2 weeks after that call, I got my deployment orders. A month of joint training exercises with Allied forces in Germany. It was the job. Non-negotiable. The night before I left, I did a final check of the house's security systems. Cameras, door sensors, deadbolts. I sat down with Serafina, not as a husband, but as an officer briefing her on the plan of engagement. "If they show up," I said calmly, "you don't have to answer. Don't open the door. Don't argue. Just ignore them. They'll leave." She nodded, the resolve in her eyes firmer than any steel I knew. "I know what to do, Van." I trusted her. But I didn't trust them. As predicted, they came looking for her a week after I left for Germany. I was in a briefing when my phone buzzed in my pocket. A video message from Serafina. I excused myself. When I opened it, I saw her worried face, and over her shoulder, the feed from our doorbell camera. My parents. They were standing on my porch. My father's face flushed red. My mother wearing a calculated look of distress. They weren't ringing the bell. They were pounding on the door. "Serafina, you open this door." My father's voice hissed, distorted through the speaker. "You're the one who turned our son against us." I saw Killian run up and cling to his mother's leg. Serafina quickly moved him out of the camera's view. Through the screen, I saw the fear flash in her eyes, not for them, but for Killian. I switched to my command voice, short and clear, enough for Serafina to hear. "Sarah, listen to me. Fall back. Take Killian to the bedroom. Lock the door. Draw the curtains." My voice was low and steady, trained to cut through chaos. "I'm watching on the security cams. They can't get in. Keep our son safe." She nodded, quickly scooped Killian up, and retreated out of sight. I ended the video call and switched to the security app on my phone. The screen split into 4 quadrants, giving me every angle. I saw my parents. Watched them yell for a few more minutes, spewing absurd accusations and bitter words. Then, as I predicted, they left, leaving a heavy silence behind. I called Serafina back. "You okay?" "I'm okay," she answered, though her voice trembled slightly. "We're safe." Good," I said. "That's all that matters." But I knew this was just the first reconnaissance probe. They had tested the defenses, and they would be back. This time, they would be prepared. They came back 3 days later. I was on the training grounds, but my phone was on priority mode, set to only receive calls from Serafina. It didn't ring. Instead, an alert from the security app flashed on the screen. "Front door. Tampering alert." My heart skipped a beat. I opened the app. The doorbell camera showed my father. But this time he wasn't pounding on the door. He was crouched down, fiddling with something metallic. A lockpick set. I never thought he'd go this far. I called Serafina immediately. "Van?" Her voice trembled on the other end. "They're trying to get in." "I know," I said, my voice turning to ice. "Fall back to the bedroom. Lock it, now." With my other hand, I was dialing the Cedar Ridge Police Department through an international line. At the same time, a female voice came on the other line. 911. "What is your emergency?" "There's a break-in at my house," I growled, my eyes glued to the living room camera feed I had just pulled up. "Address is 112 Cedar Ridge Lane. My wife and 4-year-old son are in danger. They're picking the lock." As I was giving the address, a dry, sharp click echoed through the phone's speaker. The front door swung open. My parents stormed in like wild animals. "They're in," I yelled at the dispatcher. "They're attacking my wife. Send someone now." But I knew it would take minutes. And right now, minutes were an eternity. I watched, helpless, through a small screen thousands of miles away. I saw my mother rush towards Serafina, screaming nonsense. I saw my father grab her. I saw my mother slap her across the face. A guttural roar ripped from my chest. A primal sound of rage and powerlessness. But it could only echo uselessly in a command tent in Germany. "Send a car now," I repeated, my voice hoarse. The final line was crossed when Serafina struggled, trying to get to Killian, who was screaming in a corner. I watched her get shoved. I watched her head hit the sharp corner of the stone fireplace. The phone in my hand was shaking. My entire world shrank to that single image of my wife, motionless on the floor. Finally, through the camera's microphone, I heard the sound I had been praying for, the wail of a police siren, distant at first, then growing louder. My parents panicked, exchanged a look, and scrambled out the back door. Seconds later, police officers stormed in through the front. The room descended into chaos. One of the officers picked up Serafina's phone, still connected to me. "Sir," a man's voice said, professional but strained. "This is the Cedar Ridge Police Department. We're on the scene. Your wife is injured. An ambulance is on its way." Oh, after that, there was only silence. I stood there, on a foreign military base, and I knew. The game was over. The line had been breached, and the war had begun. The silence on the other end of the line lasted for a few seconds, but for me it was a lifetime. I don't remember how I ended the call with the officer. I just remember turning on my heel and walking with a terrifying calm toward my commanding officer's office. All emotion had been set aside. All that remained was the mission. A few hours later, with an emergency message from the Red Cross confirming my family emergency, I was on a military transport flight heading home. I didn't sleep during the 17-hour flight. I sat in the loud, cold cargo hold, my eyes glued to my phone. I replayed the security footage over and over. I watched them pick the lock. I watched them storm in. I watched them attack Serafina. I watched her fall. I didn't feel anger. Anger is a hot, chaotic emotion. What I felt was something colder, much sharper. It became a mission objective. I made a list in my head. Step by step. Every necessary action. Every piece of evidence to collect. This was no longer a family dispute. This was a campaign. I landed at Joint Base Lewis McChord before dawn. I didn't go home. The house was now a crime scene. I drove straight to the hospital. I found her room. The door was slightly ajar. Through the gap, I saw Serafina sitting up in bed. A white bandage stark against her forehead. A dark bruise was forming under her left eye. In her lap, Killian was asleep. But even in sleep, his small hand was clenched tightly onto her shirt. He wasn't crying. He was just silent. The silence of a child after witnessing violence is more terrifying than any scream. In that moment, I realized my patience and endurance had been mistaken for weakness. The soldier in me surfaced. I was no longer just Captain Donovan Hayes, with a single objective: protect my family and ensure no one ever dared to cross that line again. I told myself, they have crossed every line. The game is over. Every plan, every action from now on would be calculated with the same unforgiving precision. I gently pushed the door open. Serafina looked up. For a second, I saw relief in her eyes. But then I saw something else. A fear she was trying to hide. Not fear of her attackers, fear for me. Fear of what I was about to do. She opened her mouth, about to say she was okay. But I raised a hand, a gentle gesture to stop. I walked to the bed, leaned down, and kissed Killian's forehead, then Serafina's bandage. I didn't say a word, but in that moment, as I looked into my wife's eyes, she understood. And so did I. They had thought I was still the child who would just bow his head in silence. They had thought I was still the son desperate for their approval. They were wrong. That son died on my living room floor, right beside his wife. All that was left was the soldier. I left the hospital once Serafina and Killian had drifted into an exhausted sleep. I didn't waste any time. The plan had been outlined in my head during the flight. Now, it was time for execution. Objective 1. Intelligence gathering. I drove to the Cedar Ridge Police Department. As the victim's husband, and as a military officer, I was given access to the preliminary report. I requested a copy. I also requested the recording of my 911 call. Everything was done professionally and coldly. Objective 2. Witnesses and physical evidence. I went to the neighbor with the security camera. He had already given the footage to the police, but I still asked to review it. The video captured their arrival and, more importantly, their panicked escape out the back door. Next, I returned to my house, the crime scene. It had been cordoned off by the police, but I was allowed inside with an officer. I photographed everything. The damaged door, the footprints on the floor, the overturned table, and the faint bloodstain where Serafina had fallen. Final objective: legal counsel. I contacted the JAG office at the base. I presented the facts and the evidence I had gathered. The military lawyer, a major, listened intently. He confirmed what I already knew. Burglary in the 1st degree, assault in the 3rd degree, felonies that could lead to prison time. That evening, with a thick file folder in my hand, I drove to the house where I grew up. They were sitting in the living room. Sterling was there too. They didn't look remorseful, just tired and annoyed. My mother started to cry when she saw me. A conditioned reflex. "I didn't mean to," she began. I held up a hand, cutting her off. "There will be no conversation here." I didn't sit down. I stood in the middle of the room, in my full dress uniform, and placed the file on the coffee table. The sound was dry and final. "This is the Cedar Ridge Police Report," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "This is Serafina's medical evaluation, and these are witness statements, along with copies of the videos." I let them process that for a few seconds. Sterling looked confused. My father scowled. I am giving you two options, I continued, my voice like ice. 1. You sign this permanent no-contact agreement drafted by a lawyer. You will never come near, call, or otherwise contact my family in any way, shape, or form, ever. I paused. 2. This file goes to the district attorney's office at 0900 tomorrow, and I will make sure Sterling is investigated as an accessory for incitement. The color drained from Sterling's face, from confusion to panic. You can't do that, my father roared, jumping to his feet. He's your brother. We're your parents. I looked him straight in the eye, and for the first time in my life, I felt no fear. You gave up those rights when you broke down my door and assaulted my wife in front of my son. I took 2 copies of the agreement and a pen from my pocket, placing them on top of the file. You have until morning to decide. With that, I turned on my heel and walked out the door without a single glance back. The negotiation was over. Now, it was up to them to choose their surrender. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty. No more doubt. No more compromise. All lines had been drawn. I stood there, with no need to yell or threaten further. Power lay in preparation, in precision, and in the cold resolve I had maintained throughout this battle. There were no calls that night. I didn't expect any. Their silence was a form of surrender. The next morning I picked up Serafina and Killian from the hospital. The bruise on her face had started to fade to a dull yellow, but the wound inside would take much longer. Killian clung to me, refusing to let go. He hadn't spoken a word since I got back. When we arrived home, there was an envelope slipped under the door. Inside were the 2 no-contact agreements, signed and notarized. There was no letter, no apology, just the dry signatures. I tossed them in a drawer. Mission accomplished. The following weeks were a different kind of war, a quieter one. We started therapy. Serafina learned to deal with the betrayal. I learned to control the rage that still simmered beneath the surface. And Killian, little by little, began to speak again. The house in Cedar Ridge was no longer a sanctuary. It was tainted. Every corner held a memory of the assault. We couldn't stay. I sold it. Quickly and decisively, we moved to a modern penthouse apartment in Bellevue, on the other side of Lake Washington. This place was different. Glass walls, a view of the city and the shimmering water. No front yard for anyone to trespass on. A 24/7 security desk in the lobby. It was safe. It was sterile. It was a new beginning. That evening, after Killian was fast asleep, Serafina and I stood on the balcony for the first time in weeks. The wind from the lake was strong. The city lights stretched out like a promise. Serafina leaned her head on my shoulder. Is it really over, Van? Yes, I said, tightening my arm around her. That part of our lives is over. They no longer existed. They were just names on a legal document in a drawer. They were ghosts I had permanently banished from my fortress. I had fought in foreign lands to protect abstract ideals. But the hardest and most meaningful battle was fought right here at home. Not to protect a nation, but to protect a boy and the woman leaning against me. I looked out at the city lights. My fortress was no longer a house of wood and stone. It was right here. It was my arm around my wife. It was the sound of my son's steady breathing in the bedroom. It was love, respect, and boundaries forged in steel.